Ferrari that I have ever seen in the whole of my life. He's out of the race! He's out of the race! Oh my goodness, this is fantastic!
And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.
Silverstone has come around to the Formula One calendar, and the only way to sum up this weekend's Grand Prix is it's finally happened. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Maximum Downforce, the official Downforce Radio Formula One podcast. And joining me, as always, Jake Sanson, Topher Smith, and this time around, Tom Cairns as well. Hello, Tom. Hello, Jake. And hello, Topher. It was a fantastic weekend at the British Grand Prix in Silverstone with a new format, controversy, good racing, realistically, everything that a Formula One fan wants to see, some good old-fashioned racing. Jake, there's only really one place to start here. It's finally happened, hasn't it? Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton heading down to Cops. There's only really one place that we can start. Just give me your thoughts on the incident.
Yeah, we've kind of been building up to this for about 3 seasons, really, haven't we? So it's kind of amazing that it's taken so long to get to this point. I think it was inevitable that they were eventually going to collide because they're two very pumped up, very motivated individuals who will not yield if the opportunity is given to them to do so. You know, I think that's the thing about top world-class high-level racing drivers. They will go for a gap and they will not back down from a fight. So inevitably, when you've got two minds like that, you're always going to get one person that will come off worse. And on this occasion, it was Verstappen. Thank goodness he's okay, first of all. But I think a lesson is to be learnt here in that these are two drivers that will race for the ragged edge and neither driver is prepared to back down. So now between the two of them, they've got to figure out what they do next time. In terms of what needs to happen after this, nothing. You know, it's motor racing. It's Formula One. It's the pinnacle. They've obviously addressed the situation. They felt that Lewis was at fault for causing a collision. They gave him a penalty, which I think was correct, if they had to give a penalty at all. He took it. He obviously accepted it, got out there and continued. And, you know, I don't think anything personally needs to be said about that moving on. But what it does suggest to us now is that Hamilton versus Verstappen is going to get more serious as the races go on. And their comments after the race towards each other, Hamilton's a little bit more respectful. Verstappen is blatant that, you know, this guy, essentially what he's saying is this guy tried to kill me. And that really does spice up the title battle.
And Topher, obviously, we're so focused on the moment in the fact that the two have finally come together. What ramifications does this have on the championship? Are they going to come together again? Are they going to fight each other harder? Are they going to be a bit more lenient? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's the sort of question that we won't really have an exact answer to until it does happen again. I'm not sure if it will or not. As Jake said, it has been building up to this for quite a while now. And when I was watching the race live, throughout that first half of the lap before the coming together of Cops, they're banging wheels down the Wellington Straight. I was actually sitting there thinking to myself, they're going to come together. Like, just the nature of the battle they were having across the course of that first half lap, straight away, I just felt as though it was inevitable that there was going to be a collision of some sort. And sure enough, it happened into Cops. As for the ramifications of that particular crash, I think it will, more than anything, probably pump up Verstappen to try and go and do an even better job over the rest of the season. In Verstappen, he feels like he was very hard done by that collision, and I think in some ways rightly so. And he's now going to think that he needs to put it behind him, he needs to move on and think, how's he going to go and beat this guy across the course of the rest of the season? I mean, he already has been. He's got, 4 victories out of 5 races to lead up to Silverstone. He's been on a tremendous run of form. This crash, I don't think will change too much in the way that they see each other as rivals, but I think more than anything, it's probably just going to pump up Max Verstappen to try even harder to try and get that first title.
And Tom, I know you were quite outspoken with this on Twitter and the fact that you're saying your opinions on it, and largely I think we can all agree with you. But the fact that Lewis Hamilton, much like the England football team after last week's playing against Italy, the fact that he was receiving racist abuse and discrimination on Twitter and social media, and I think you said, I think there was something about over 6,000 Reddit comments being deleted or something along those lines. It's not what Formula One wants to be associated with it.
I mean, this is not just a problem with football and Formula One, it's a problem in society. And unfortunately, this is something that's been going around for years. And I think with social media now, it's become an easy platform for anyone to post anything. And I mean, anyone could even just post a decoy account, for instance, someone pretending to be a Lewis Hamilton fan or someone pretending to be a Max Verstappen fan or whatever, who may be somewhere over in the Middle East, where they're making the account from or wherever it may be. And this is something that us as a community, as a motorsport community, cannot tolerate, And Lewis Hamilton has punched above his weight throughout his career, from where he was when he was a kid, when he was racing karts and having to cope in a school with people who he claims that some didn't like him because of his skin color or whatever, but the fact is he's bounced that off and actually just pursued his goal and achieved what he has done up to now is remarkable. And what he's done for the sport is truly brilliant. He's a 7-time world champion. He's won 99 races. I think it was 98 pole positions, I think he's got now in Formula One or something like that. It may not be 98, but it's somewhere along those lines. But he's the best driver in Formula One has ever had, statistically. And, I don't think you're going to find too many more drivers, if not a few, that are going to be better than him. And in regards to what he was receiving afterwards, was absolutely despicable from the people who have behaved in the way that they did on the internet, with all the the racist comments, the monkey emojis and the slurs, which I will not obviously mention or say because it's vile. But this is something that Formula One has got to address. And there's even something going around now that I've seen as well, because people have screenshot what's been happening, and it's something to do with people who are going to the Dutch Grand Prix planning like a tomato throwing plot or something like that. Yeah, it's absolutely horrendous how these so-called fans choose to behave or what they are planning to do. Is not a good advert for the sport, and it's most certainly not a good advert for the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, considering that they're about to host their first race for Formula One in 36 years. And I felt I had to get what I said off my chest, what I've been saying, what I've been dying to say for a long time, because how can Formula One? I mean, it's the worst I've seen with regards to whether it's a driver, a race engineer, a mechanic, or someone who works in the Formula One paddock as a pundit, being given that much racist abuse in all I've been watching motor racing. The sad thing is, it was not surprising, because as soon as the accident happened between Hamilton and Verstappen, a lot of stick from people. He was always going to. And then there's just those individuals who just take it too far with their reactions by giving Lewis Hamilton what they gave to him. That was just beyond recognition, and nothing more needs to be said about that. I wonder, you'd be interested to get your thoughts on this, Jake, as well, because I'm lost for words with what I've seen over the last few days from people.
Yeah, I'm absolutely baffled by it. And the thing that really interests me in particular about this whole debate is, and I think about this in various different motor racing incidents, is how would the reaction have been if it was the other way round? If it was Verstappen that was basically seen to be the instigator of the incident and Hamilton was the innocent victim. I wonder how many, or what the reaction would have been the other way round. Because it is interesting how, in a way, the team, Red Bull, I think, has kind of stirred some of this up and made the sort of the reaction, not the racist reaction, but certainly a lot of the sort of the kind of blame, as it were, towards Hamilton a little bit worse. But then, obviously, the fans have been able to just go off in their own sort of ridiculous diatribes. And it is horrendous. We've just seen in recent times with Formula One, the We Race as One movement. It doesn't appear to have made even a dent on what's actually causing issues and what the problems really are, which is unfortunate because the intention is there, but clearly there's a heck of a lot of work to do.
And I think I can speak for everyone. In fact, I know that I can speak for everyone at Downforce Radio, and we say that we condemn the actions and words of all of these small-minded Neanderthals who decide to bring in racial abuse and language like this, Jake.
Absolutely, yeah. It's never been part of our makeup. We've never been accepting of that kind of thing. We are very much about equality for all in motor racing, whether you're a woman, whether you are black, whether you are from a country far across the world, whether you are LGBTQ, whatever it might be. Motor racing is meant to be a place where people can enjoy the sport at all levels, at all places, no matter who you are or what you do. And the kind of people who feel that this is the kind of comment they want to share about a driver who's just doing his job, the job he's being paid to do, which is race, then as far as I'm concerned, you need your head examined. It's as simple as that.
One thing that I'd like to quickly pick up on here, Tom mentioned just a moment ago about the potential of tomato throwing that's going around at Zandvoort later this year, which essentially would be an attack on Sir Lewis Hamilton. The way that I would go about dealing with that, I don't think it's acceptable at all to even plan that sort of thing. I don't think it will happen in the end because, they have security at Formula One events that can prevent this sort of thing from happening. But just if something does happen that is aimed in the direction of Lewis Hamilton for the point of retaliation for that accident between himself and Max Verstappen, I think the FIA should come down really hard on the circuit itself, not necessarily fining the circuit for the actions of the fans, but maybe say to them, if your visitors are going to go and do these sorts of actions, then we won't have a Dutch Grand Prix in the future. And then basically put it in the hands of those spectators who are planning to do these actions against Lewis Hamilton and say, if you want to continue to come to a Formula One Grand Prix in your home country, you will be sensible, basically. I just don't see why these guys feel the need for retaliation. It is a sport at the end of the day, and it is a dangerous sport. These sorts of accidents will happen regardless of who's to blame. They do happen from time to time. But I don't see the need why there should be any sort of retaliation, especially in the form of a kind of attack like that. So I think the FIA should put out some sort of warning to the Dutch fans and say, if you are going to act in such a manner as to throw projectiles at a competitor, then we'll take away your Grand Prix. That's just one idea of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not the last time something like this has come up. I can remember an incident in 1999 when Mika Hakkinen and Eddie Irvine were having their title fight. I think Eddie Irvine was sent a message by a crazed fan basically stating, I could train myself in a particular part of the circuit and shoot the tyre of Mika Hakkinen's car at the highest point so that he has an accident. I mean, it's bonkers because we seem to have been in a situation the last few weeks where sport in general has just become ridiculously tribal. And I never expected Formula One to go that way, but it clearly seems to be something that is I don't know whether it's because people have been caged in lockdown for so long and they're just going a little bit stir crazy or whatever it is. But I didn't expect to see this kind of, sort of tribal idiocy in Formula One. I always thought the fans were a little bit more respectful than that.
Well, there's always been an element of that within sports, so not necessarily at a tribal level, as you put it, but take football, for example. There's always that bit of banter, Manchester United versus Chelsea, where your team's rubbish and all that. There's always been an element of it throughout the years, however long its history that spans. But I think social media has been a bit of a catalyst for it in some ways, because it's allowed the fans a bit more of an opportunity to come together. I mean, back before social media was even a thing, you only really had your local communities when you had the availability to actually meet up in person and then, be that level of banterous about it. But with social media, it's now come to the point where it's not really even banter anymore. It's just more mean in a lot of cases. And that's because it's more readily available. mean, you don't just have your local community, you have your following of people on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit, wherever, and you're able to basically come together in this manner. And it's just reached a point now where it's almost becoming dangerous, the level of communication you have with these like-minded people who feel the same sort of disdain towards their competitors. In the example of Sir Lewis Hamilton, he does have his fans, he does have a lot of them, and for the right reasons, of course. But then there are also all of those people who are against him for whatever reason, be that they're Max Verstappen fans or whoever, be they racist or whoever. I mean, totally unacceptable. But because we're able to have these communities built up a lot easier online, it basically becomes a bit more of a prominent topic with how they're able to convey their message. And I do love social media. I love the ability to be able to meet new people, talk to your favorite drivers or team personnel or whoever when it comes to motorsport. But then there's also like the dark side of social media, if you like, where it just becomes almost an unbearable place to be. And I mean, we have all of these different initiatives. Like we've got Hamilton's one, for example, that he set up to fight racism. I'm completely behind those causes. I think they're a great idea. I think there's really good message behind them. But if I'm being completely honest, I don't think I'm going to see any significant change to those attitudes for a long time. Maybe not even in my lifetime. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's going to take a lot to be able to convince that many people to basically not be trolls online.
I think with social media, I think it's taking its toll on people's mental health. I mean, I'm fine using it. I mean, even with what's going around, it's not going to stop me from using social media. But we shouldn't stop using social media because the minority of people are being, discriminative. Because that's like saying to someone, stay off Twitter. Telling someone to stay off Twitter is like saying stay away from school in a way, because it's just saying it really gets to me sometimes how some people think they can get away with saying certain stuff on the internet. And I think with social media, sometimes with the communication of which you potentially have with other people, it can destroy people's lives, it can destroy people's relationships, because there may be some things out there that can mentally scar people, and that's something that can't be tolerated in any way. So that's why I reiterate my point from my tweet the other day. More needs to be done. More needs to be done than what's currently already been done by the social media platforms to help keep the sites in a safer, more harmonious environment, let's say.
And moving back to the incident, I want to get all three of your opinions on this, because there was a large amount of people, most people actually, who watch Formula One, who are arguing who was at fault for the incident. So, Jake, you've already touched on this, so I'll come to you first, and then we'll move on to Tom, and then we'll finish up with Topher, and then we'll end the discussion about Hamilton and Verstappen so we can move away from it.
Yeah.
But if you were to place blame on a driver or not, what's your opinions on this?
I mean, if there is blame to apportion on somebody, you have to look at it from the point of view of the current modern trend of Formula One. Clearly, someone deserves a penalty for every single incident that happens nowadays, which I'm a bit fed up of, to be honest. There's not enough racing incidents in the sport of Formula One anymore. I was watching Dijon 1979 the other day, René Arnoux versus Gilles Villeneuve, and they were overtaking each other every third corner, banging wheels with each other, forcing each other off the track. It was brilliant, but we'll never see racing like that ever again in Formula One, the way things are currently going, because it's clear that every single incident that happens in motor racing now at Formula One level deserves a penalty. And it's a bit ridiculous, really, in my opinion. If you have to apportion blame to anyone, I personally feel you shouldn't, because they're two racing drivers racing for a position. It's a racing incident. Let it go. If I have to apportion blame to anybody, it's going to be Hamilton, but only because, he ended up understeering into Verstappen. But that's what happens in a motor race. That's what happens in a motor racing battle. It's not that he did anything wrong. He didn't do anything intentional. He's racing. But I don't see why that deserves a penalty. I don't see why doing your job when you're a racing driver warrants a penalty for that. and he did take a penalty, which is fair enough. And then he moved on from it and bounced back. So I don't think the penalty was too harsh. I don't think it was too soft. I think it's just part of the current trend of Formula One. But if it was up to me, I would have said, look, you two need to sort out your differences yourselves. This isn't for us to get involved with. You need to figure out how to go racing. I would have slapped them both with a verbal warning, because obviously it's clear that for the couple of corners building up to that, something was going to happen. So I kind of feel it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other because of.
And Tom?
Yeah, I perfectly agree with Jay. I mean, if I was to put any blame on the driver, it's going to be leaning more towards those, but only just because, supporting what Jake said, the drivers are designed, or they are paid to do what they do, and that's to race aggressively, robustly, but fair. And Lewis saw the gap, went for it. The gap, he was able to get through the gap, got alongside into Cops, and the two came together. So what I would say is, when you're on the inside going into a corner like what Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen were doing, you're never going to nail the apex as sweetly as you would do if you were taking the race in line. And Max clearly assumed that Lewis wasn't still going to be there. He thought he would back out of it, but he didn't. And this has obviously provoked the F1 fan community. But, I mean, a 10-second penalty nowadays, a time penalty that is the second most mild of penalties that any driver could be given. The most mild of penalties back in Jake Sanson's era would be, in the 80s and 90s, where I think it was a 10-second stop and go, wasn't it, Jake? That was the most mild of penalties given out to any driver.
Yeah, I'd say so.
And, a 10-second stop and go penalty is perhaps one of the harshest. Well, I say one of the harshest. It's one of the most draconian of penalties if you were going to give a driver during the race, because you're losing about 30 seconds or so, at least. Coming into the pits, no change of tyres or whatever, and you have to stop in the box for 10 seconds and then off you go. I think with the incident with Verstappen and Hamilton, the drivers know the risks. They are taking a risk. It doesn't matter which motorsport series it is. They are taking a risk because they're paid to take the risk, and the passion makes it worth the risk, in the words of Murray Walker. I think Max Verstappen, he'll have felt wounded after that, but he would at least know that he was going to have that kind of accident with someone at some point. Particularly someone like Lewis Hamilton. But I think the reason why it's getting all the attention is because they're the two championship protagonists. If this was somewhere towards the rear of the field, not as much would be discussed about it. And I think that's part of why I think Lewis is becoming an easy target.
And Topher?
Well, when I watched the race live, I called it as a racing incident pretty much straight away. To me, it looked like it was just two drivers who are racing hard and just had the inevitable coming together. And having seen all of the multiple replays, all the different angles of the crash, I don't see any reason to change my answer. To me, it looked like Lewis Hamilton, he understeered into the corner at the same time that Max Verstappen turned in on him. So it was a bit 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So I'd put that down as a racing incident. But if I was to apportion a penalty to anyone, it would have been Hamilton, on the basis that he was on the inside and he was never fully alongside Verstappen. So by the word of the law within the regulations, it was Verstappen's corner. He had the right to turn in when he wanted to because he was the one who was ahead on track. And Hamilton maybe should have backed out of it. But yeah, I still think it was a racing incident. As for the penalty, as we said, it was a 10-second time penalty, which he took at his pit stop, which I think if you want to look at the consistency of the stewards across the course of the season, was probably the right decision to make in giving him that particular penalty. But then after that, Lewis then went and put in an absolutely blinding drive and won the race anyway. And we heard Christian Horner after the race saying, well, it wasn't really much of a penalty, was it, if he went and won the race anyway? Which I suppose is one fair way of looking at it. But then on the other side of the coin, Lewis Hamilton put that incident behind him. He took his penalty. He then got on with it and put in an absolutely stellar drive to go and win the race anyway. And I think if you're going to put in a drive that good, then very clearly you do deserve to win the Grand Prix. But then that begs the question, was it enough of a penalty if it really didn't affect him in any way, at the end of the race? And that's not a question that I can really give an answer to. I'm not a racing steward. But as I said earlier on, my personal opinion of the incident was that it was purely two drivers who were racing each other hard, fighting for track position, and neither of them wanted to give in, and it ended with one of them in the barrier. To me, it was just a racing incident. I don't think there was really significantly more blame one way or the other. It's just one of those things. It's two drivers who both are fighting for a championship. One's fighting for what would be a record-breaking 8th title, and the other one fighting for his first. Of course, they're going to get a bit tempered from time to time. It's just one of those things. It will happen. It's happened so many times in history, and it will happen again. Not necessarily between Verstappen and Hamilton, but again, at some point in the future, two championship protagonists will come together on track again.
Can I make an analogy to the incident? Do you remember Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna in Portugal in 1989, where Mansell had already been black flagged for reversing in the pits, and then he went for a move on Senna regardless into turn one. Senna left the door open, Mansell was on the inside, the two came together. The blame, I think, was leaning more towards Mansell, but not so significantly, because Senna had left the door open on the inside, as pointed out by James Hunt himself when he was in the commentary box alongside Murray Walker. Would you agree with that, Topher?
I think that's a little bit more of an exceptional circumstance, because Nigel Mansell had been black flagged and should have come into the pits to retire the car. So he really shouldn't have been in a position with Ayrton Senna in that way anyway. It shouldn't have happened, because he'd been disqualified from the race and should not have been out on track at the time. But when you look at that instance in isolation, regardless of whether Mansell was black flagged or not, if Senna left the door open, as was pointed out by James Hunt, then of course Nigel Mansell's going to go for the corner. I mean, Ayrton Senna even said it himself, that famous line, if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. Yeah. So Senna did leave the door open, which allowed Mansell to make the move. Yes, it did end in tears at the end of that move, but if the gap was there, why wouldn't Mansell go for it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the 89 analogy is a very good one, because essentially, the whole reason we love this sport, the whole reason we watch it is because we want to watch racing drivers battle for positions. When Schumacher hit Hill, when Mansell hit Senna, when Senna hit Prost, these are the big moments. These are absolutely the big moments of the sport. So, why are we shying away from it and having a go at these two drivers, or chastising these two drivers for giving us the entertainment we want? I think essentially the two things that need to come out of this whole thing are that we need to decide what we want from Formula One as an entity. Do we want drivers to race wheel to wheel and potentially hit each other because it spices up the racing? Or do we want them all to run in a processional line and not overtake each other, and then everything is fine and dandy and nobody gets a penalty? Or do we want to actually use this as an opportunity? The sport is exciting. Everyone's now talking about it. It's going to do Formula One no end of good if we focus on the racing and the battle between Verstappen and Hamilton from now on, and not any of the garbage that's on the sidelines. This is what the sport is supposed to be about, the racing between two competitors. The stuff that's come with it, the sniping at Red Bull saying that, a 7-time world champion shouldn't be driving like this. Verstappen drives like that. We've seen Verstappen drive like that before. It's not like it's an isolated incident between, one guy who's squeaky clean and one guy who's an absolute thug. Verstappen has driven that ruthlessly with other drivers before. Whether it's caused incidents or not, you can't turn around to say, a 7-time world champion should know better than that. That's a bit like saying, Verstappen clearly doesn't know what he's talking about because he's never won a world championship. And that's not true either. It's a false argument. It's a pathetic argument to say a 7 times world champion should know better than to drive like that. That's how you win races. That's how you win championships. Schumacher won 7 titles that way. Senna won 3 titles that way. Prost won 4 titles that way. It's a stupid argument. I don't like that argument at all. And I think it kind of completely negates the purpose of motor racing. So if we embrace what's good about the fact that there's a rivalry now, there is this banter between the two of them, that's what Formula One is about. Let's enjoy it.
I think it's a very fine line to find, though, when you talk about like how far is too far when it comes to racing each other. And you pointed out earlier on about the Battle of Dijon '79 between Villeneuve and Arnoux. And that was fantastic to watch. Everyone who's seen that piece of footage thinks that is pure Formula One racing.
Yeah.
And we don't really get that all too often these days because stewards are more readily willing to hand out penalties. But it's such a fine line to find because if we allow more leniency for the drivers to go and bang wheels a bit, rubbing his racing sort of attitude, that at the same time, it kind of opens up the door for potentially deliberate maneuvers, or to use a snooker term, a professional foul, where you deliberately do something wrong but make it look like you did it accidentally on purpose, if you know what I mean.
I guess that's what the sport has to decide. That the sport has to decide and then stick with that decision. Because there's so much inconsistency at the moment. They need to come to a conclusion as to what is fair racing, what isn't fair racing, and stick with it. Because from one race to the next, some will give no penalty for an incident, others will give a penalty for exactly the same incident. So essentially the sport needs to come together. They need to sit down all together, the drivers, the teams, the officials, and have a meeting and figure out what is racing and what isn't racing and decipher it once and for all and then stick to that. Because at the moment, it's just carnage.
It's one of the reasons why I actually really enjoy over in America, because their sort of attitude is rubbing is racing over there, and you get a lot where a driver will go down the inside of another, they will bang wheels a bit, trade a bit of paintwork, and then crack onto the next corner. And if the driver who loses out in that, instead of whining over the team radio, "Oh, he hit me," they just go and get back after him again and try to take the position back. They just properly go at it. And
I mean,
yeah.
I was going to say that it's funny because Verstappen has basically said, he pushed it too far over the limit. But when you were winding him up like that for half a lap, what did you expect? What did you expect was going to be the response? They're clearly banging seven bells out of each other 2 or 3 times over the course of the lap. And you said you were expecting the conflagration to happen. Well, big surprise. It happened. What did you expect was going to happen? Seriously, what did they think was going to happen between the two of them having that race? I mean, it's just blindingly obvious that sort of thing is going to spill over and become over the top of an incident. I think Verstappen needs to wind his neck in, remember what sport he does, and then adapt his driving accordingly, because he knows now that Hamilton's not going to back down.
I think if we take the whole of that first half lap of the British Grand Prix in isolation, we had the first few corners where Verstappen and Hamilton were banging wheels a bit throughout. They were pretty much side by side throughout the entire first lap. It was brilliant to watch. And then we had the coming together at Copse. It was that particular incident at Copse, which was the one that was investigated, and not anything before that, even though they were banging wheels. So I think a simple solution to this, if 2 drivers bang wheels, trade a bit of paintwork or whatever, just simply ask the question, are they both still going? Are they both on track? Yes, good, crack on.
And before the podcast was planned fully, the thing that I wanted to start off with was the new format, but obviously Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen had their say on that. So either way, let's move away from the incident now, guys, and take a look at the other big talking point of the weekend. Now, the only problem is Jake and Topher have slightly let us down here by not actually watching the sprint qualifying format. So
I'm sorry that I'm busy on Saturdays.
Yeah, same.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Jake and Topher about their opinions on it, and then actually go to Tom for a full sort of debrief regarding the weekend format as a whole. Jake, I know you said you had quite a strong opinion on how the weekend format should be, so just give us that.
I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting concept. I'm not entirely sure why it needs that. I think these sort of ideas are supposed to improve the racing. Isn't that the purpose of it? And we've come into 2021 and the racing has instantly been better anyway. So I don't really see why we needed to go down this idea to improve something that is already organically improving itself. So that's kind of how I view it at the moment. I don't really think it needs to be changed. And changing something for the purpose of changing it is such a slippery slope to go down, because then you're just going to be changing everything for the purpose of doing something. It's like it's the justification for activity. And I think that has a bigger risk of damaging the sport long term. So I don't really see the need for it. And that's a difficulty because I kind of want to see them make good changes, but I don't see the point of this one. I clearly feel that, sprint qualifying, it's a great idea on a video game, but I don't really see the purpose of doing it in real life. And I kind of feel that it's a wasted exercise. I haven't been convinced by it yet, really, to see any worth or value in it. I mean, yeah, it's great you see another race between the drivers. It didn't change much other than Verstappen jumping Hamilton and Russell getting a penalty and ruining the chance for him to get a point on his debut. That's the only thing I really saw. So it kind of gave me more negatives than positives. And in a way, you could also argue that it inadvertently and indirectly caused the crash between Verstappen and Hamilton. So in my opinion, I don't really see what value it's given us. In fact, if anything, I think it may have cheapened it a little bit.
And Topher?
Going into the idea of sprint qualifying, like when this first floated around and then it was announced that it was going to take place over 3 Grand Prix weekends in the season, I was a bit skeptical of it at first, but I'm always willing to try new ideas and try different formats to see what works. And basically, it could end up being a better format than what we have at the moment. And how do we know if we don't try? But having seen what's come of it, with qualifying, I don't think it really needed changing in the first place anyway. The current format that we have of the 3-session knockout that we have is one of the best qualifying formats we've ever had. It's absolutely brilliant to watch. And I kind of feel so it didn't really need changing in the first place. But like I said, willing to give it a go and see what it's like. And I feel as though Formula One needs to basically say, if it doesn't work, we'll hold our hands up and say, fine, we tried it, it didn't work. Let's just crack on with what we currently have and what we know works, which is exactly what they did with the elimination qualifying back in 2016, if any of you remember that rather awful, impolite word about it. Thinking about sprint qualifying now in hindsight, I did have my initial annoyance about it because, as I said, I'm usually busy on Saturdays. I don't usually get to watch qualifying anyway. And I actually was kind of annoyed that I was missing out on watching some racing over the Grand Prix weekend because I wasn't able to watch it live on TV. But then actually it was pointed out to me on Twitter that it's actually beneficial for those who are usually busy on Sundays who can't always watch Grand Prix, because then by them being free on the Saturday instead of the Sunday, then they get to watch some actual live racing over the course of the weekend. So it's beneficial for them. And when that was pointed out to me, I thought, you know what, actually, that's a very fair point, because there are people out there who are busy on Sundays. They can't necessarily watch the Grand Prix every time that it's on. So by giving them a race to watch on Saturday, they then have that excitement of the 5 lights going out that blast down into the first corner. And you do get that excitement. We got all the battles out of the field. We had Russell running in the top 10, Perez having his off and then dropping down to start last on the grid, or eventually from the pit lane, rather. Like my initial skepticism of it was more down to the fact that I would be missing out on watching some racing. But looking at it from a broader aspect of the entire Formula One community and their availability to watch it, it gives them an extra day to watch some racing. And you know what? I actually think that's a good thing. I'm not going to go ahead and say that this sprint qualifying that we have, that we trialled in Silverstone, is definitely the way to go forward. But to basically go against what Jake said, I think it actually has more positives than negatives. And this is a debate that will rage on for, probably for the rest of the season, because we've got more trials of it coming up later on in the season where we can gather some more data on it. And I'm actually really glad that we are trialing it a more than one race this season, because anyone who's done any sort of scientific experiment, like at school, or maybe you do science for your profession or whatever, the best way to collect an accurate source of data is through multiple experimentations. You can't gauge accurate data from just one experiment. So by doing it 3 times, we've got the data from this one, and we've got the public response as well, which from what I've heard has been mostly positive. So now let's go and do it again, and then go and do it one more time. And then instead of having one set of data, you've then got 3 sets of data with which you can make a more informed response to any potential alterations to the calendar. If it was down to me, like I said, I don't think there was any reason to change the format. I think it was fine the way it was. It's quite a traditional format. Practice on a Friday, qualifying on the Saturday, race on the Sunday. That's, but, sometimes Formula One said sod tradition, let's try something new. Sometimes to the better, sometimes to the worse. With sprint qualifying, like I said, my initial skepticism has actually been somewhat overturned. I'm not going to go and say that, they have to change the sprint qualifying. I think overall, I still prefer the usual 3-session qualifying format and then a Grand Prix. But I definitely do see the positives in sprint qualifying. And if they introduce it in future seasons as a permanent thing, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world.
And Tom, overall, what's your verdict on sprint qualifying then? Because I must admit, although it had its flaws and certain stupid language like the Pirelli Speed King Award for qualifying on Friday, I think with a few tweaks, it could actually possibly work.
Yeah, I mean, I would tweak maybe by allowing, the fastest driver over the course of a single lap, qualifying. He should be the one getting pole, not the driver who wins the sprint race. I'm yes and no with this one. Yes, because, we get to see some racing on the Saturday and, the qualifying on the Friday is something to be ready for. And the weekend, it felt like the weekend lasted longer than like a normal race weekend. We don't learn too much on Friday, and then Saturday, obviously, with the qualifying and stuff, and then the race, obviously, is the main core of the weekend. And would I want to see sprint qualifying being used on a permanent basis? I actually wouldn't mind it, but I do feel that there are tweaks that need to be made to it. I mean, 17 laps was a good number of laps for a sprint, and we did see some action. We saw Fernando Alonso, who had started the 11th on the soft compound, because most of the drivers started the race on the mediums, but Alonso was on the soft compound, and he was able to get up from 11th to 5th before the end of lap 1. And it helped him massively for the race itself, for him to get into a point-scoring position. And that's one of the plus sides where you can actually see some overtaking on track on a circuit like Silverstone, where overtaking is very much possible. So I'm kind of on the fence with the idea of the sprint qualifying. I wouldn't mind if it's being used, just as long as it's managed properly and not turn into a bit of a farce for the drivers.
And I think that's actually going to be the question of the day, guys. Rather than cause some controversy about Hamilton and Verstappen, I think it's good to ask what you guys listening think about sprint qualifying. Let us know on our social media or in the comment section down below if you're watching on YouTube. So, moving to the actual race, guys, and in fact, still to sprint qualifying. Jake, Sergio Perez, it wasn't exactly the best weekend for him after a spin in sprint qualifying, and then he couldn't get back through the field in the actual Grand Prix, having to pit at the end just to stop Hamilton from gaining a single point. It could have been better for the Mexican.
Yeah, it's a real shame because I think this is going to be looked back as his black spot, essentially, over the course of the season. And I hope there aren't too many, because there has a bit of a tendency for a driver in the second Red Bull seat to be looked at for getting something wrong or having a bad weekend as, right, well, that's it then. We've got another young star waiting in the wings who can take your seat. And Sergio Perez has been a breath of fresh air to Red Bull. I genuinely think it was nice of them to kind of do something different, go outside their pool and come up with a driver who's genuinely deserving of a drive in a top-level team. This is a team that's going to win the Constructors' Championship, and that was the first race, really, that Sergio Perez didn't look like he could hack it. Every other race this season, to me, he's looked like he could hack it. So I'm hoping that's just a one-off blip. I don't really know what the reason for it was. It was just a bad weekend. Sometimes drivers just have bad weekends. And in the point of view of Perez, it's a little bit more awkward because he's obviously trying to justify his existence within the Red Bull senior team and prove that, he's now world class and a regular race winner. He obviously won a race this year at Baku, which was very deserving. And, it's a difficult one because having come off the back of winning Baku a few weeks ago and then to come to a race like this at Silverstone and be so publicly down the order, It's a difficult one for him, but I think it's one of those situations where we have to give him a little bit of leniency. He's had a lot of pressure on him over the course of this season to deliver and to perform, and there's no two ways about it. He's done an exceptional job, and it's because of him that Red Bull are actually leading the Constructors' Championship. We come to expect brilliant performances from Max, and he's been amazing, but because of Sergio, Red Bull are leading the Constructors' Championship, which is something we haven't said since 2013. So that is quite an incredible achievement.
And I hate to seem every time, Topher, like I'm just finding some excuse for Valtteri Bottas to be concerned or looking like he's going to be removed from that Mercedes drive. But despite the fact that he did have quite a good weekend, he was able to back up Hamilton for much of the weekend, third in qualifying, third in sprint qualifying, and then third in the race. I don't know if you noticed it, but there was just something about Bottas this weekend that he just looked like almost not. I don't want to say like he didn't care anymore, but he just looked like he wasn't the same Bottas we saw at the beginning of last season.
I mean, Silverstone was definitely one of his better weekends of the season so far. Very consistent, very strong performance, and it netted him a third place on the podium. And that's the sort of performance we should be expecting from Bottas at the moment. We've had races in the past and at the start of the season where he's been down fighting for like P7, P8, P9, P10. And that's not what you expect from someone who is driving a Mercedes. So I think this was definitely a good weekend for Bottas. It was sort of where he needed to be in terms of backing up Hamilton and helping Mercedes in their fight for the Constructors' title. The point that you raised about his general demeanour, I mean, this isn't anything new for Bottas this season. Just his body language in general, you can kind of tell that he's not 100% happy. Like maybe he knows he's not staying in Mercedes past this season, which obviously is speculation at this point because nothing's been confirmed. But if you then go and look across in the Williams garage and look at the demeanour of George Russell, he's in a very good place right now. And you can tell in the performances that he's putting in. He put it into, was it P9 in the sprint race before the penalty was applied for his coming together with Carlos Sainz. And also in his interviews, there's one interview that he did with Sky Sports F1 with all the crowd behind him. He was sort of like teasing about the Mercedes scene next season. He didn't actually give anything away, but he was like sort of playfully teasing about it. And you could, well, from what I gathered of that through his body language and his like, little facial expressions, I think he knows that he's getting that promotion into Mercedes next season. And he's just being a little bit coy about it, a little bit playful, just teasing, like, oh yes, I'm going to be driving a Mercedes powered engine next season, like, that sort of thing where he's playing it to the camera. So yeah, I very much gather that he knows that it's going to happen, and I think that Bottas maybe knows it's going to happen as well. So what Bottas now needs to do, if he's not going to get the Mercedes seat into next season, he basically needs to put himself in the shop window to other teams. Putting in a performance like he did in Silverstone, where he was very consistent across the entire weekend, third on the grid, third in the sprint race, and third in the Grand Prix. That's a sort of performance where a potential employer might be looking at and thinking, he might not be on Lewis Hamilton's level, but he can still go and get the job done when he's on form. So there have been rumours about him and Russell maybe doing a straight swap with Bottas going down to Williams. So Williams could potentially be looking at and thinking Bottas could absolutely be an asset to their team in 2022. Maybe in other championships as well, because we all know full well that Formula One drivers, once their career is done in Formula One, they tend to find other racing adventures in other series. So World Endurance Championship, Formula E, IndyCar, just to name a few. So Bottas maybe isn't putting himself in the shop window just for Formula One, but maybe for other championships as well. And he needs to put in those performances now, because we're about halfway through the season now. This is a sort of time where contracts are going to start to get sorted out. Toto Wolff said himself he's going to try and sort out the second seats for Mercedes within the summer break, which is coming up after the next race after Budapest. So Bottas really needs to put in this level of performance now, or he might not just find himself out of Mercedes, he might find himself out of Formula One. So whatever he can do to get a good result now, he needs to put in those consistent performances week in, week out. He had the bad start to the season. We all saw what happened to him, and when it all came to a head in Imola, when he had that coming together with George Russell, which really shouldn't have happened. I mean, the Mercedes fighting with the Williams, that shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah.
So Bottas, he has upped his game in Silverstone. He now needs to keep that level for his own future, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. He's clearly got a love for rallying. He's clearly got an opportunity with a team out there. He clearly knows his sport. He's very good at it. He uses it for training for Formula One anyway. I think he should do a Kimi. I think he should be looking for a top level race drive in the World Rally Championship, because the pressure's going to be off him. He's going to enjoy his sport. He's going to be able to maximize his potential. I think in Formula One, he's literally come to the limit of what he can achieve. Realistically, if he's not in a Mercedes next year, is he ever going to win another Grand Prix again? I don't think he is.
And Tom, when we actually went into this weekend, I don't think anyone would have predicted that the person who would lead the most laps this Grand Prix weekend would be Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari. So he really did luck into the crash with Hamilton and Verstappen. It's just a shame for him and Ferrari that he couldn't go all the way.
Yeah, well, I would say with Leclerc, I mean, he just had a stellar weekend, putting his Ferrari, fourth, and he was able to just stay in touch with Bottas as well during the sprint race, and then in the race as it happened, on merit, he was leading for the majority of that. It's just a shame he wasn't able to see it out to the end when Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, as you can imagine, charged the battery up, on the laps when they needed to have done before they just went full pelt, and it paid off for Lewis. As for Charles, I think for his effort at the weekend, it definitely deserves a 10 out of 10 for it, because I think he definitely deserves to be winning that race, no question. And not to forget that he had that engine melody. He had his own engine melodies during that, where his engine was cutting out a little bit. I don't know if that really compromised his chances, because I don't think it really did, but it definitely wasn't an ideal scenario. But I think whilst Leclerc may be feeling very down about not winning that race when he felt that he should have done, he has to look back on the weekend and think, that's my best weekend of the season so far.
And two drivers at McLaren and Ferrari, respectively, both used to be teammates for the last 2 years, Jake. Sainz and Norris both had very, very good races, but at the end of the day, it was the poor pit stops in the middle of the race which really did possibly cost them a podium.
It's a very good point. With both Sainz and Norris, it was very interesting. In fact, it was quite astonishing through the course of the entire race that it wasn't just those two teams that messed up pit stops. It was quite a few. And I think that comes down to the intense heat that we had in the pit lane. They don't expect it at Silverstone at all. It was pushing the 30s, and it's quite a tough environment in that pit lane anyway, because it's all very, very intense and it's very intimate, that particular pit lane. There's plenty of space, but it's all quite in the radar of the fans. So the pressure to screw up is immense. And we were watching it, myself and the RGMMC crew out in Spain, and it was so on the edge of our seat stuff, because you couldn't tell who was going to get a good pit stop and who was going to get a bad pit stop at one point. And it was all down to the human endeavor. It was several teams that actually cracked under the pressure in those pit stops, which was unusual. You don't really get to see that too often. One team per race making a pit stop is so rare these days, but to have 4 or 5 different pit stops go wrong, it was quite unusual. So we definitely got to see an interesting side to Formula One, which was the more human side of pit stops. And I've been banging on about this for ages. I think that while the 2-second pit stop is very impressive, it's very boring. I don't like pit stops at the moment because of how ridiculously quick and boring they are. They're all between 2 and 2.5 seconds, and it doesn't really add anything to the race. Whereas if you have teams that are making mistakes in the pits, that does actually bring an interesting dynamic to it. You know, who's going to get the pit stop right and who's going to get the pit stop wrong. So while it was very unfortunate for both Sainz and Norris, and definitely in the case of Norris, it cost him a podium. You could argue that with Sainz, it probably could have done as well. While it cost them a podium, I think it definitely spiced up the race. What it did do, though, is for me personally, it flattered Bottas. Because before that, Bottas couldn't even keep up with Norris, which is quite disappointing from Bottas's point of view. That actually reveals more about Bottas's shortcomings than it does about Lando and the McLaren team making a mistake. Because up to that point, they were doing a much better job than Bottas. And for me, that is actually a wider issue for Bottas, and that's almost the final nail in his coffin. If McLaren have got to the point now where they're better than Bottas in pure pace, while Hamilton is able to be as strong as he is out in front of them both, then that for me is game over for Bottas and potentially looking at Russell coming in, or even Norris coming in. Now that really would shake things up.
Just one thing that I want to say here, Jake. You mentioned about the fact that you find pit stops to be a little bit boring now.
Yeah.
So my fiance recently has actually started to get into Formula One quite heavily as well. Like, she's really taken to it. And one of the things that has mightily impressed her through watching it is actually the pit stops. So especially watching Red Bull, how they can now pull off subpar 2-second pit stops. And pretty much every time we see one of these like really smooth, fast pit stops, she just sits there saying, How can they do it that quick? And she finds it really impressive. I think the difference there is the likes of me and you. We're so used to seeing pit stops in Formula One now. Like we've been watching it for years now. I remember back in the days when pit stops would take about 10 seconds on average, the days when they had refueling and there wasn't any rush on changing the 4 tyres. And then it transitioned into these 3-second, 2-second pit stops where, we found them impressive at first, but now we're used to them. But for a new fan, people who are getting into Formula One, it's one of those aspects which they find to be really impressive, like the synchronization of the mechanics in the car hitting its marks, wheel gun, tyre off, tyre on, wheel gun, off you go, in less than 2 seconds. I mean, that's quicker than the time it took me just to say that description there.
Yeah.
And me and you, we're used to seeing it. We think, 2.5, that's slow. But then you have one where it's like 2.9, and she's there going, how do they just do that so quickly? So I don't think pit stops are at all boring, personally. I do love to see how the team acts in harmony around a pit stop. I do kind of miss the days of refueling.
I do.
If I will be honest. I mean, there was the obvious danger aspect that came with it. I mean, I don't think I need to remind Jos Verstappen of that.
No.
But it was an extra strategic element, which added a lot more intrigue to the race. And nowadays, we have these fast degrading tyres that Pirelli have made. So they degrade a lot faster than the likes of Bridgestone and Goodyear back in the day. Now, throw refueling back into the mix. Would we see like 1-stop strategies or 2-stops? Might we even see maybe some 3-stoppers or 4-stoppers again? I think it was Michael Schumacher back in, I think it was Magny-Cours back in 2002, if my memory serves me correctly on that one. He won the race on a
3, I think. It was 3.
No,
It was 3.
It was 4.
2004. It
was
early
4.
noughties.
Okay.
Yeah, he won the race on a 4-stop strategy through constantly running lights for the whole race and building up the gap. We don't see those sorts of performances anymore because of the way that the regulations are now, where they top the car up to the brim as starts a race and then go through to the end. So, I mean, obviously, I know why they got rid of refueling. There's a safety aspect, which is a very valid argument. It's quite hard to argue against that. But just imagine Pirelli's fast degrading tyres, the speed of these Formula One cars, and then throw in a low fuel stint into that. How incredible would that be?
Yeah.
And although we've just said that the heat was on in the pit lane, Tom, and the heat was on the drivers, one man who seemed to thrive in that heat was Daniel Ricciardo, because he has finally, after all of these races, taken the step up and gotten where he needs to be finishing 5th, 4th. He looks like he might have control of this car now.
It looks that way, didn't it? On a circuit where he made his Formula One debut at 10 years ago in a HRT. Who would have thought that? But Ricciardo I thought he had a weekend to remember. he wasn't involved in too much trouble. I mean, he did get the benefit of the fact that Carlos Sainz had that awful pit stop. I think it was 12 seconds or something like that, and which Ricciardo was able to capitalise on. And you can't say that Ricciardo didn't have a good weekend, because he did. So I hope that is a sign of things to come for Ricciardo between now and the end of the year. I think on the track at Hungary, where he's won at before, I think we can definitely see more of the Ricciardo that we all love. The determined, fierce, robust Ricciardo that everyone has been looking at, with such a sweet personality of a guy. I think we could well see it in Hungary on a track where I think McLaren and Ferrari, believe it or not, where engine power isn't as paramount, whereas it's more the aerodynamics that's important. I think McLaren and Ferrari could have even better weekends than they had at Silverstone. I actually really feel that this is one of the tracks that they can do it.
And as you guys know, my favourite segment of the show always comes around sort of halfway through, and that's going to be the same this week. Tom, I don't know if you've been watching any of the podcasts, but the On This Day segment in the show is where we take a look at events which happened on a certain date in Formula One, which obviously today, the 21st of July, is the day we're recording. And I ask you guys a question about it, and you simply have to give me the correct answer. So, do you guys want to know what today's question is?
Go for it.
So, all the way back in 1962, Jim Clark took the first of his British Grand Prix victories. He secured the win, pole position, and the fastest lap at Aintree. This is the question for you guys today, is how many wins did Jim Clark take at the British Grand Prix? So if we start with Jake, go to Tom, and then finish up with Topher.
I believe it's 4. I think it's 4 he got in the end.
Okay, Jake says 4.
That's a really tough one. I was thinking 3 to begin with, but now that Jake has said 4, I'm kind of inclined to say 4 as well. I'm going to go for 4 as well.
And Topher Smith.
I think it's 5, actually. Just trying to rack my brain through all the stats I've seen over the years. I think it might be 5.
Oh.
So I can tell you all that Jim Clark took 5 British Grand Prix victories.
Well done, Topher. Well done. Fair play.
So yet again, Topher has taken another step forward to the can of Rich Energy or a Cadbury's chocolate bar, depending on his choice.
I cannot wait. I still haven't tried Rich Energy. Actually, I still haven't seen Rich Energy in any supermarket or newsagents or corner shop anywhere. I've never seen it.
That's because they don't put it in the shops. They do it online. I have actually drunk some, and it's very good.
Does it taste like Red Bull?
No comment.
Moving back to the Grand Prix, Alpine had a much better weekend than they have over the past few Grand Prix. Obviously, Fernando Alonso has been loving life in that car, but Esteban Ocon, on the other hand, hasn't been so lucky. Fernando Alonso was the main talking point of Saturday, though, Topher, because his start, I don't know if you saw it on Twitter or any social media, but his start, he went from, I believe it was 11th to 5th, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong there. Just in the first, I think it was seven corners, something along those lines. It really was a fantastic start.
It was, and I think that was the kind of Alonso that everyone has been after. And he even came out and said that was one of the best races he's had in his career, in terms of the tools they had and what he was able to do with them. So you have to say it was Alonso's best weekend of the season, personally. And I've got a good feeling in Hungary, on a circuit that he loves so much, he's done so well at. I think Alpine, like McLaren and Ferrari, could be one of those in the mix. Probably not for pole or for the win, but definitely to be in the sort of middle region of the points. Should it come to them, even if they're like a 10th or 2 off the pace to Mercedes and Red Bull, I think it still could be their target for the weekend ahead before the summer break.
And meanwhile, Jake, Esteban Ocon, on the other hand, after his poor races, he stepped up and I believe he took 9th place.
He's done well, actually, Ocon. And it's a funny one because Ocon is one of those drivers who I have been reserving judgment on for a fair while now. And I have not really been convinced from time to time of just how good he is and whether or not he's deserving of his place. A lot of people have talked a lot of great stuff about him. I'm starting to wonder if he's slowly becoming another Hulkenberg, in the sense that, he's clearly done an incredible job in the junior formulae and he's a trusty pair of hands when the chips are down. But does he have that killer instinct to be a world champion? I don't actually know. And it's a tough question to answer. But certainly he's very good for Alpine. Being French, it's commercially good. But obviously in terms of his relationship with the team, he's clearly found a home that he's quite settled into now. He's going to be there for the long time with Alonso. So I think the harmony within the team is going to be quite easy to sustain. So I don't think we've seen the best from Ocon yet. I think he's still building to it. I think he's still getting to that plane. And it isn't going to be too long before we really start to see the maximum from Ocon really start to emerge. I think we're kind of beginning something. 9th position on the outset doesn't sound like a particularly fantastic result. But when you take it into the context of where Alpine have been, where they currently are, and where they could have ended up, I think Ocon actually did a very good job with that race. And, he's been able to get the most out of it this time.
And Topher, meanwhile at AlphaTauri, it was sort of a race of two sections really, because at one point Yuki Tsunoda was nowhere near the points, and Pierre Gasly was running quite comfortably in it. But right at the end, it almost seemed to swap over as Gasly got a puncture and Tsunoda ended up finishing 10th. And even still, Gasly managed to claw back to 11th. I
mean, I didn't really see too much of AlphaTauri this weekend. They're usually one of those teams that are quite prominent, like especially with Gasly's performances in qualifying. He's been easily among the best of the rest, behind the likes of Mercedes and Red Bull. I didn't really see too much of them during the race. And with Gasly's puncture, I saw an image after the race. It was from him being interviewed for TV. I can't remember which station it was with. But he looks very distraught. He looked very hot and bothered. So it sort of gave the impression of he fought so hard to get into the points, and then to have it all undone at the end by a puncture. I mean, he clearly wasn't very happy with how that happened, but that is racing. These things happen. I suppose it was good in a way for AlphaTauri that it was Yuki Tsunoda that was able to pick up the pieces from that and still bring home the final point. As far as AlphaTauri is concerned, they're not going to be fighting for the driver's title anytime soon. So their main aim is the constructors and what position they're going to finish when it comes to the end of the season. Because as the saying goes, points means prizes. And the higher position you have in the standings, the more prize money you get. So for AlphaTauri, despite Gasly having a puncture, I think they can still be happy with the fact that it was Tsunoda who was able to come home and still pick up that 10th place and get that point, which could end up being crucial in the championship and dictate the final finishing position, instead of someone like George Russell, who's in 12th, Antonio Giovinazzi, who's in 13th. So it might not necessarily have been good for Gasly, but for a team, I mean, it's making the best out of a bad situation, I think. So, yeah, AlphaTauri probably would have liked both cars in the top 10. I mean, what team wouldn't? But yeah, like I said, it's the best out of a bad situation, I think. They still got a point at the end of the day.
And Tom, Sebastian Vettel didn't have the best of weekends overall in terms of racing. Obviously, he had a good qualifying, made up some places during the sprint qualifying, and unfortunately just lost the back of his car on the exit of Luffield on the restart when he was fighting Fernando Alonso. But I think one thing that was certainly highlighted from this weekend, especially the scenes from the post race, is just how almost a down-to-earth guy Sebastian Vettel actually is, in the fact that he was going around helping pick up the rubbish from the grandstands, carrying around the bin bags. Afterwards, he went to a recycling plant to take a look at how everything works there. He's sort of, especially with Austria as well, going to help some children build a beehive and selling his own sunflower seeds. It really is just sort of, he's becoming more and more wholesome as it goes on, really.
Yeah, I mean, the weekend for Seb wasn't exactly how he had planned it. I mean, he did well in qualifying. He's been struggling to get into Q3 on a lot of occasions this year in the car. And of course, in the race, it just didn't quite go to plan for him, unfortunately, with that spin. And of course, he retired in the pits due to something that was overheating in the Aston. But in terms of what he did afterwards, he has shown that he is the person that people actually love. He's not just a racing driver. He reminds me of Ayrton Senna in a way where a lot of what he earns, or time that he actually dedicates to, to help people, to help the environment. I mean, back in the days of Ayrton Senna, he was earning his craft, and some of what he was earning went towards, towards poverty and helping education for children over in Brazil, and all that. Which Jake and Topher may support me on that. But with Seb, I just, the weekend wasn't great, but says what he did afterwards was rather touching, and I do like to see Seb still fighting towards the front because he deserves to be. But it's going to be some time yet before Aston Martin can be back into a position where the Racing Point once was this time last year.
And Jake, on the other side of the garage, Lance Stroll, he had a quiet race, but it was strong. He managed to come across the line and score some well-deserved points for Aston Martin. And once again, proving that despite him being labelled as a pay driver or only in the team because his dad owns it, he is really proving this season and last as well, he does deserve to be in Formula One.
Yeah, I don't think that's up for debate anymore. I genuinely don't. I don't think it's up for debate anymore whether Lance Stroll deserves a place in Formula One. I think he's earned enough credence now that he has. He was the youngest ever podium finisher when he got the podium for Williams at that time. He's got a pole position now. He's fought for victories. I don't think it's any question anymore as to whether he deserves his place. I think now it's about motivation and it's about, helping to build Aston Martin up. What's really telling about this weekend is, where Aston Martin currently is compared to where Racing Point was last year. I mean, you've got to look at it from a perspective of what has gone wrong, or are they literally just waiting for the 2022 regulations? I really hope it's the latter, because clearly they obviously had a lot of controversy around them over 2019 and 2020 about, did they build their own car or didn't they? And I think they needed to shy away from that a little bit. So maybe this year they've decided, well, we're going to build in with Aston Martin, we're going to build it quietly, and then in 2022, then we'll come back strong. And I'm kind of hoping that's what their tactic is. But points are points, and it's obviously important for Aston Martin to get points at home. It was good for Lance Stroll because, again, I think it just enhances the fact that, he does deserve to be there in the field. And yeah, he is a good driver. I don't think the pay driver argument for him is particularly valid anymore because he has been able to get results with it.
And Topher, moving from one British element of Formula One to possibly the hottest topic in British motorsport right now, or at least British Formula One, George Russell getting into Q3 for the second time in a row. But obviously, a fantastic performance to get that Williams into Q3. But I think the past 2 weekends have highlighted that car has absolutely no race pace whatsoever, because he dropped after the collision with Sainz in sprint qualifying, the grid penalty, that didn't help him. But he was nowhere during the race. I don't think I saw him once.
Well, in the build-up to the Grand Prix weekend, looking for sprint qualifying, I did actually have a little bit of think to myself, how ironic would it be if in sprint qualifying, where only the top 3 finishers get points, how ironic would it be if George Russell, if that's the race that George Russell finally finishes in the top 10 of a race? And look what happened.
He did.
Was it P9, was it, I believe? He finished in the sprint race. But yeah, no points on offer. So yeah, a little bit of amusing irony there. But with regards to the actual Grand Prix itself, I don't think he was necessarily in the best mood regarding his grid drop down to 12th. I mean, he felt as though he was a bit hard done by that penalty. He felt as though Sainz was just as much to blame for the collision. So George Russell, I think he kind of felt a bit up against it after that. If he had started within the top 10, I think there would have been that extra, fire in the stomach that he needed to maybe go and get the job done and bring the car home in the top 10. But when you get given a grid penalty like that, it changes your mindset, and not necessarily in a good way. So then starting out of the top 10 in P12, it is a different mindset, because he's now thinking, I've got it all to do now, rather than I've got a great opportunity here. So it wasn't really his best weekend in terms of race pace when it mattered. But if you look at the whole picture of the entire weekend, it was one of his best performances of his career so far. And take a look at sprint qualifying. It was still a race, and within that race, he held his own. He held off other cars behind him, faster cars behind him, and came home in the top 10. And that is exactly the sort of performances that he needs to put in if he has designs on getting that Mercedes seat next season. Of course, the actual Grand Prix is where it matters in terms of getting points for the championship. And as it stands, he is still on 0. But yeah, look at the entire picture. It was another very strong weekend for George Russell. He's only 2 positions points, and he finally got that car into the top 10 on merit in a race scenario. He's making adverts for himself for a move up the grid next season, and he's doing it at the right moment when Toto Wolff is looking at signing his second driver in the summer break. So, yeah, George Russell, if I was Mercedes, I'd be saying sign him up now.
And Tom, I'm sure you would have seen this over the week, but Alfa Romeo signing a brand new deal with Sauber has been deemed a multi-year deal, but it's going to be reviewed every year. So it sort of gives both parties an option to end the contract if they so desire. But despite the fact that they've got this new deal, and despite the fact that they've got a future in Formula One, I think the only real way of saying it is to quote Kimi Räikkönen here, and it's just for them to stop messing around and sitting there saying, "Oh, we could have been in the points here. It's a real shame because of the contact with Perez." But at the end of the day, they just need to work harder and make the car faster. That is the words of Kimi Räikkönen after the race. And realistically, it's hard to disagree with him.
Alfa Romeo are an interesting one, because if you remember a few years back, before the days when they tied together with Sauber, they were arguably the slowest team on the grid. 2016 or 17, most certainly. They were just propping up the field. Whereas now they are on the fringes of scoring points, but they haven't been on the fringes of scoring points often enough for me. And they need to take more strides forward in order to do that. And I don't know whether it's the power unit, I don't know whether it's the design of the chassis, with the barge boards and the floor and everything like that, you name them all. I think they're looking more towards next year with the new regulation changes rather than this year in my book. I think they feel that they've done enough to beat Williams, and they are ahead of Williams in the constructors. But it's just, can they take more points away from Williams between now and the end of the year to keep hold of 8th in the constructors? I'm confident they can do that, because time and time again, George Russell keeps missing out on the points with the way he's performing in the races. I mean, he's not doing anything wrong, really. It's just I feel that Williams are sacrificing race pace more towards quali, because if they're going to have any chance of scoring points, then they need to make sure they finish high. The performance in the races have shown that they haven't got genuine pace to score points, whereas with Alfa Romeo, they've got more of a chance, but they're just not exactly firing from all cylinders, challenging the likes of AlphaTauri, Aston Martin, and Alpine. So that's their problem to deal with, because at the moment you've got 8 cars ahead of them. They are Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren, and Ferrari, who are they're running away with just finishing in the top 8 positions, whereas points for like 9th or 10th are on offer, and that's why they're not scoring as many points as what they should be doing.
And Haas, Jake, they've obviously we've covered this thoroughly. They've had a difficult season. They're waiting till 2022, developing the car. But Nikita Mazepin recently, I think it was last episode, I said that Nikita Mazepin was starting to redeem himself in the media through the use of comedy. We had the Mazespin and the door, which he gave to Gunther Steiner. But now at the British Grand Prix, he actually beat Mick Schumacher over a race distance. Now, obviously, I think he's done so once before in Monaco, but after Schumacher crashed in qualifying or crashed in FP3, which prevented him from starting in qualifying, it's a step up for Mazepin, because obviously he's had a tough start to the season. We won't go over why, but it looks like things might be on the up for him, but he still needs to keep working.
It's certainly a good start. It's a good step in the right direction. Obviously, time is a great healer. I'm not saying that people should forgive him for why he was in the doghouse in the first place, but at the same time, we need to live in a generation, I think, of ultimate forgiveness. If people are willing to say sorry, then you need to allow them to adopt, adapt, and improve. So much of society now is utter condemnation forever and ever for one mistake somebody's made. Now, he's obviously done something wrong, but if he is genuinely repentant and is trying to rebuild it and trying to become a bit more of a role model, then who are we to stop him? Judge not lest ye be judged and all that. So, he's definitely making good strides in that direction. I think the way he has embraced the comedic factor off track has definitely given him a little bit of a chance to chill out a bit and kind of take it on. I think if he had been in any other team, it would have been very, very difficult for him to shake this off. But because he's with Günther Steiner, who is a bit of a joker, he has got a very wicked sense of humour. He is a little bit laid back. He obviously wants to make the situation work. So he's found methods by which he can actually get this sort of stuff done with Nikita. So, and it is important, you've got to try and find harmony within the team, especially when you consider that he's got to be with him for a couple of seasons. They've signed a couple of years of deals for both drivers. So you've got to make it work. You have to stick your Ted pegs in the ground and hope that it isn't going to rain every day. So, they're making the best of a difficult situation at the team. They are trying to make progress. Mick is clearly very talented. We've seen that a couple of times. Even in a really awful car, he's made the best of it. It's good to see that Nikita Mazepin is finally starting to make some progress. He's not completely there yet, but he is getting there. And I don't like this whole attitude of this guy needs to be completely chastised forever and ever. That doesn't give anybody the chance to rebuild. It doesn't give anybody the chance to be good. I mean, look at Mike Tyson in another sport. He was the ultimate bad guy, and how he's been able to rebuild himself as an athlete and a role model through his podcast and through his television appearances. He's a completely changed man compared to what he was. Now, are we to suggest then that Nikita Mazepin is not allowed to change? He's not allowed. He's got to be the villain forever. I don't think that's a particularly kind or particularly Formula One-esque mentality. I think with everything that we've been seeing with Hamilton and Verstappen, I think it's very easy to forget that these guys are human. You've got to let them make mistakes and got to let them rebuild. So Mazepin getting on with it, I'm hoping that's just the start of his renaissance. It's a little painful for a few people for obvious reasons, but you do have to let these people rebuild. You do have to let them see the error of their ways and come back from it. And hopefully he is rebuilding in the best way possible.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I think that's pretty much everything covered from the British Grand Prix weekend. I want to thank you guys. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Topher. And thank you, Jake, for joining me for the episode of the British Grand Prix for Maximum Downforce, the official Downforce Radio Formula One podcast. And thank you very much to you for listening wherever you are. Remember to check out our social media, Downforce Radio on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as the website, downforceradio.uk, where you can listen to the radio station, check out all of the best and latest news on our website. And realistically, we have a brilliant season coming our way, and we're going to be covering every single race after every single Grand Prix. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and goodbye.
Go, go, go! And it's happened immediately! This is amazing! The worst start for a Grand Prix